So hi everyone, it's a pleasure for me today to introduce Thang. So we did our PhD together in Liège with Pierre Maquet, and where Thang studied the neural correlate of slow wave sleep. Then he moved to where did you move? You moved to Concordia. You did your postdoc at Harvard Medical School. Then you moved to Concordia University, where you are professor, and you are the chair of the Sleep Neuroimaging and Cognitive Labs. And you are also vice president of the Canadian Sleep Society, and also you're part of a lot of different universities. Thang take part to a lot of scientific publication on sleep and on the role of sleep and on cognition and health. And so we are very happy to have you here, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Bonjour à tous. Thank you very much, Virginie, for the introduction. Thank you, Sophie, for an invitation to come and visit the lab again. So it's a pleasure to be in Geneva. And thank you to all of you for attending the talk. So today I'm going to discuss a little bit about one part of our research program that is related to sleep and cognitive health. And you see the title is a bit broad because our research program is a bit broad as well. So I'll start with, I don't know if it's mandatory here, but we always need to disclose our conflicts of interest, but I'm not going to discuss about any clinical trials with medication. So this is not going to be conflict. So this is the outline I was proposing to go with you. So first I'm going to look at how sleep can help us better understand why some people have cognitive disturbances, particularly with aging. And then as a clinician, I'm also interested to see how we can use the research we investigating in terms of mechanisms to then design interventions. And so you'll see that I'm going to discuss with you some of the intervention studies we're doing with cognitive behavioral therapy, but also different other interventions such as physiological manipulations with sounds, rocking bed, something that has been deeply studied here in Geneva. And I'll finish with some more recent study where we're looking at the interaction between sleep and exercise on cognitive health. Okay, so you may be aware of that there are different studies that have looked at how sleep is impacting cognition, and particularly the onset of neurodegenerative disease of aging, such as Alzheimer's disease and so on. Most of these studies have looked at self-reported sleep metrics, such as sleep duration, some sleep quality. But I think one of the issues with those studies is that it's difficult to really have some, some clinical relevance or practical relevance when it comes to sleep duration only, because some studies have shown that short sleep is increasing cognitive risk, for example, but short sleep, we don't know if short sleep is it because people sleep too little, or is it people have insomnia, or is that because people have other sleep disorders that might cause sleep difficulties? So in my lab, we are interested particularly in the insomnia disorder. And why is that? Because insomnia is very frequent. It's one of the most common sleep disorders. It affects 16% or 10 to 20% of the population. And we recently published a prevalence study in Canada showing that it's 16% in Canada of adults that have insomnia disorder. And insomnia disorder, for those of you who are not familiar, is defined by sleep complaints. So difficulties staying asleep or falling asleep, or during at least 3 times per month, 3 times per week for at least 3 months. And importantly, it's becoming a disorder when it leads to significant distress and disruption of daytime function. And that's important because as we age, people often have insomnia complaints without necessarily having some daytime impairment, but it needs to be associated with fatigue, difficulties concentration, and so on to be considered a disorder. And insomnia is particularly interesting for looking at the interaction with cognitive decline, because we know that insomnia symptoms tend to increase with age, and that's been investigated in many publications. I'm just showing you 2 examples from Europe and from Asia, where it clearly shows that the prevalence of symptoms increases with age in both men and women. You see, notice that women have also more sleep complaints, insomnia complaints than men. So in some of the Canadian data we have, so we have different cohorts in Canada, which are really interesting to investigate because we have some sleep measures. And this is an example of the Quebec cohort for the early identification of Alzheimer's disease. And I'm being involved in this because I proposed this different sleep assessment in this cohort. And so what has been shown in this cohort is that insomnia severity, so insomnia symptoms increase when you go from healthy older adults to older adults with subjective cognitive impairments, so SCI. So SCI and MCI, mild cognitive impairment, show also an increase in insomnia symptom severity. And what we were wondering is, well, if insomnia is increasing when you become older and when you have cognitive difficulties, could also insomnia actually be a risk factor for the incidence of cognitive problems aging? And we investigated another Canadian cohort, which is the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, which has approximately almost 30,000 people, middle-aged to older adults, with a variety of assessments, questionnaires, but also cognitive testing. And very interestingly for us, there were also some questions specifically for insomnia symptoms and daytime complaints and frequency of insomnia symptoms. So we were able to define within this cohort who of those people had no insomnia symptoms in green, those who had insomnia symptoms without daytime function impairment in red, and those who had insomnia disorder in blue. And so this is the first paper we published was to look at the cross-sectional data at baseline, looking at the different groups and taking into account all the different demographic and health comorbidities that are known to affect cognitive functions. And we looked at how this affected neuropsychological testing, and we found that the only domain that was significantly different was the declarative memories. This was a verbal memory test where people with insomnia disorder showed lower performance than people with insomnia symptoms or healthy controls of the same age. So that's a cross-sectional analysis. But then we wonder, well, does the presence of insomnia symptoms or insomnia disorder over time, if you develop insomnia over time, are you at higher risk of having cognitive worsening? And we then published a study looking at the 3-year follow-up. So from the people who didn't have insomnia symptoms at baseline, we looked at those who stayed without insomnia symptoms in red, those who developed insomnia symptoms only in green, and those who developed insomnia disorder in blue, okay, across the 3-year time period, and look at how this evolution affected the cognitive functioning. So we didn't find actually any difference in terms of objective neuropsychological testing, but we found that those who developed insomnia disorder over time also had a higher risk of having a self-reported memory worsening. So that's what you see in the bottom part, and also had a higher risk of having a diagnosed memory problem by a physician. So this showed that in this study, at least we demonstrate that people who develop insomnia disorder over time also have a high risk of subjective memory decline, at least, than other groups, even when you adjust it for the comorbidities. And importantly, that's only in the group that develop insomnia disorder, not only insomnia symptoms. And so that's important because insomnia disorder is something that is treatable, and as we'll show later, that can be subject to different interventions and thus potential preventive strategies to mitigate cognitive worsening. Then, of course, insomnia disorder is only defined subjectively. That's a syndrome, that's a disorder and condition that is defined by patient self-reports. But it doesn't tell us about what's happening in the background. What are the physiological functions that are affected that could increase our risk of cognitive decline? And as Virginie mentioned, we've been studying, since my PhD, I've been studying brain rhythms during sleep, including spindle and slow oscillations. And those of you who study sleep and memory are familiar with this model where we know that spindle and slow wave produced by thalamocortical interactions are thought to facilitate the replay and the storage of memory traces from hippocampal to neocortical storage. And we now also know there's been some studies that suggest that not only spindles and slow waves are important, but also the coordination between those two types of oscillations, their synchrony, their coupling, is important. This has been shown mostly in healthy adults, younger, and mostly on single night studies that have shown these correlations between coupling and memory consolidation. So in my lab, we were interested to see, well, if this is true, we should be able to see whether actually this is something that would be seen after learning night compared to control night. Because the question is, as always, is it a trait, or is it really something that is induced by memory? So in this study, we did investigate all healthy older adults. And we studied the sleep during 2 nights, a baseline night and a night after a declarative memory test. It was a classical word pair associate task. And after sleep, they had the delayed recall. And what we were interested in was to look at not only spindle and slow waves, but also their coupling. And so their coupling can be studied in different ways. You can study what is called the modulation index, which is basically the strength of the coupling, or you can study also the coupling phase, which is basically the distance between both oscillations, more like the temporal synchrony of those waves. And what we show is actually, first we didn't see, so that's not reassured, but important thing that we didn't observe a significant change in the coupling modulation index or coupling phase from the baseline to the learning night. So that's actually arguing against the fact that this is something that is really related to memory consolidation itself, but rather a trait that is related to cognitive abilities in general. And what is interesting is that it doesn't seem to be the modulation index, but more the coupling phase that influences our ability to better recall memory after sleep. That's what we observed here, where there was an association between the change in coupling phase between the learning and the control and the learning night with the word pair consolidation score. So the more the spindle was close basically to the slow wave peak from the baseline to the learning night, the more people were able to better remember word pairs after sleep compared to before sleep. So this suggests that, yes, coupling is important, but might not be directly dependent on learning, but rather facilitate processes that make people more able to consolidate memories on the long term. And so now, what does it happen? How does it work in clinical populations? So we did collaborate with a group in Spain who have a nice cohort of patients with Alzheimer's disease. In this cohort, the patients had a baseline polysomnography, and at baseline, they also had cerebrospinal fluid sampling with biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease measured. So amyloid beta, phospho-tau, and other biomarkers I'm not going to mention today. And then in the follow-up, people have they have also different clinical assessment. So MMSE, which is a standard global scale for cognitive function, the ADAS, which is also a scale for cognitive function in Alzheimer's disease, and other cognitive tasks. And this was repeated at follow-up. So they had the follow-up at 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years for the cognitive testing. So with that, what we wanted to see is whether some baseline sleep architecture could predict the changes in cognitive function and the biomarkers. And that's something that's a paper we just published in Alzheimer's and Dementia a couple of weeks ago. And we found that actually the main predictor of those measures is spindle activity, spindle density. Spindle density predicted at baseline, predicted changes in ADAS-Cog and MMSE over time in such a way that more spindle metrics, so better spindle activity, basically led to less deterioration of global cognitive function from the ADAS-Cog or the MMSE over time. But also at baseline, higher spindle activity was associated with less biomarkers of neurodegeneration. So this really suggests that sleep microarchitecture, not only in healthy adults, but also in clinical population with dementia, is important to understand the cognitive worsening of those people over time. And this was controlling for AHI, age, sex, and I think that's it. And we also conducted mediation and moderation analysis to have a closer look at the interaction between those three factors. And what we observe is that spindle density and also slow station duration mediated the effects of phospho-tau and beta amyloid on cognitive functions, which is very interesting. So this seems to suggest that really sleep architecture is explaining at least part of the effect of these biomarkers. But the relationship is so complex because we found that also phospho-tau beta 42 moderated the relationship between spindle and slow wave duration and cognitive changes over time. So basically, we have three factors that are really interacting with each other, but it's not only that sleep is disrupted when you have dementia, but also sleep itself contributes to the neurodegeneration that affects people with dementia. And so all this is important because these have potential therapeutic implications. And in the second part of my talk, I'm going to talk now more about interventions and physiological manipulation to try to see how we can change or investigate if we perturb the system to see if we can actually have some change in cognitive function. So the first thing we did was to look at insomnia, because insomnia is a well-known condition in terms of presentation. At least the phenotyping is still investigated because there's probably a lot of different subtypes. But all the guidelines recommend one main treatment for insomnia, which is called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And this consists of basically a psychological intervention where people have to go through different strategies to change the perceptions and the behaviors around sleep. So this includes sleep hygiene, relaxation, but mostly changing the expectations about sleep, also changing the sleep schedules with restricting time in bed and so on. This is usually administered over 5-6 sessions by a psychologist, either individually or in groups. But in this case, this is a trial that we published a couple of years ago when we looked at CBTI effects on a variety of outcomes. But first, this was a randomized control trial with CBT and waitlist. And in this case, as in line with other people have shown that so CBT decreased insomnia severity index significantly and not waitlist. So that shows that at least our intervention worked. But interestingly, what we wanted to see is the effect on objective and subjective sleep, and then on also cognitive functions. We looked at the effect on sleep diaries. So there are different ways of measuring sleep. You can measure sleep subjectively with sleep diaries, self-reports, and you can also measure sleep objectively with polysomnography or actigraphy in other instances. So in this case, we looked at sleep diaries and sleep efficiency with polysomnography, so in lab sleep study, and we observed that CBT increased sleep efficiency from a self-reported perspective, but not objectively. So sleep efficiency is basically the ratio of the percentage of time that you spend in bed during which you sleep, at least you think you sleep. So people had a better sleep efficiency after CBT than waitlist from their self-report, but not from the polysomnography. And that's actually in line with what a lot of other studies have reported, that actually CBTI mostly improve subjective sleep assessment rather than objective ones. But what we showed here is that actually what it does, CBTI actually decreases the difference between objective and subjective sleep measures from baseline to post-interventions. This is, for example, in terms of total sleep duration, total sleep time. In our sample, these were people, middle-aged adults with insomnia. At baseline, on average, they had approximately an hour of underestimation of total sleep time. Okay, so that's, which is common, like people with insomnia in our sample, when they were asked how much time they slept, they on average underestimated their sleep time an hour less than what the sleep recording showed. But then after treatment, after CBTI, we observed that those in the CBTI group, actually the difference really decreased in such a way that it was no more significant. So there was really an alignment between the subjective and objective sleep assessment. But the discrepancy, what we call misperception, remained in people in the waitlist group. So this shows that the CBTI, this type of intervention seems to work mostly on subjective assessment of sleep, but maybe it works by reducing the discrepancy between subjective and objective sleep measures, what we call in the sleep field, the sleep misperception. And so what happens in terms of cognitive functions? Well, but it's actually interesting because it kind of mirrors what I just showed you for sleep. When we looked at self-reported subjective cognitive abilities, there was a trend, not significant, but a trend for the CBTI group to actually improve their subjective cognitive abilities. But when it comes to, in this study, we limit the cognitive assessment was limited to attention, executive functions, and working memory, so ANT and NBAC, and there were no change at all. You see that the two groups behaved exactly the same way. And so based on that study, we found that there's a trend to improve subjective perception of cognitive abilities, but no objective cognitive change. And this is also something that other group has reported. And this is the group in Oxford that showed that digital CBTIs, because now CBTI can also be administered online, compared to waitlist, improve subjective perception of sleep. So that's the BC-CCI, the first line, which is the British Columbia Cognitive Complaints Inventory. Subjective assessment of cognition, but all the objective cognitive domains, digit spans, trios, pairs matching, and so on, show no objective change. So does it mean that there's nothing to gain from CBTI in terms of cognitive function? Well, I don't think we can say that yet. The first question we need to better address is, do we have to consider insomnia people as a single group, or is there some ways to look at people, subgroups who might be responding differently? And so this comes back to one of my interests, which is sleep microarchitecture and spindles. And we had published a couple of years ago, in 2017, that if you looked at people with insomnia and the way they respond to CBTI, and we look at spindle density at baseline, we actually previously reported that people with higher spindle density showed a higher response to CBTI, with more better improvements in terms of PSQI, for example, which is another sleep scale, compared to those with lower spindle activity. And that's something we recently tried to replicate, because this was that study was based on just a pre-post design, no control group. But then on the same data set that I showed earlier with the sleep misperception, we wanted to see if this would be the case in the CBT versus waitlist design. So it was the same study, the same data set. And we looked at how spindle influenced these treatment responses. And what we observed is that actually we confirmed that people in the CBT group with higher spindle density, as you can see here, so the blue group is those with in the CBT group. The spindle density at baseline, the higher the spindle density was, the more the decrease in ICI was over time, and that's the case also for PSQI. Now, very interestingly, what you observe also is those in the waitlist group showed, so there was a significant interaction between group and time, in such a way that actually not only the CBTI group had a better response with more spindle, but the waitlist group showed the opposite. So actually a worse response with spindle. So that's something we're trying to investigate, but it seems to really show that these effects of spindle is really specific to the treatment group with CBT. So in total, this shows that maybe there's interest in better phenotyping insomnia when we're looking at response to the treatment. And given the role of spindle in memory and cognitive functioning, this might also have an impact on how we looked at responses to cognitive functions. And actually, that's something we're currently investigating, but in an ongoing trial. So I'm not going to present results, but just letting you know that we're conducting right now a trial to see if CBTI, not in the general population of insomniacs, but in older adults with insomnia and subjective cognitive complaints, could improve not only sleep, but also cognitive functions. Because insomnia is heterogeneous, maybe we don't find any effect on cognitive functions if we're looking at a population that is not that effective by cognition. And actually, studies have shown that if you look at the insomnia population in general, there's not a huge impairment of cognitive function. So maybe we need to be more restricted to a population who complain about the memory or their cognitive functions and who have insomnia. So that's something we're currently doing right now. And what we did was we built an online CBTI intervention platform, which is called eSpace, that include different modules for sleep, also for nutrition, memory, and so on. And the sleep module at that time included 7 capsules, but we now extended to 10. That targets not only sleep, but also anxiety and also depression now, by using the typical CBT approach, cognitive behavioral therapy approaches. And this is this program works as a self-help therapy, so there's no therapist involved, a bit like Sleepio. But the content was readapted to be relevant for the adults. So we do that. So this is available right now in French and English. I'm just going to show a few snapshots. So there's a visual content that is presented like as simply as possible in lay terms, with also a voice-over. So for example, this shows the sleep cycle, the sleep stages. This is there is a module that shows that's the sleep education module, where we explain sleep hygiene, we explain the stimulus control, and then there are quizzes at the end to check the learning experience. And so right now we currently doing the trial. We plan to recruit 250 people that will be randomized to either a control or an online CBT or control. The active control is actually them basically completing the other online modules that are not related to sleep. And with this study, we designed to be conducted remotely. So everything is done remotely except the MRI, obviously. But we send the sleep diaries, actigraphy, EEG. We're using headbands, the Muse headbands, to be able to measure the sleep architecture at home. And the cognitive testing is done also on an iPad. And then we're testing them after 12 weeks of the intervention. And again, after 22 weeks, and the MRI actually takes place at baseline and at 22 weeks. And we hypothesized that people in the active group the therapy group would have a better response to different cognitive tests and also to the function task in the MRI. And so right now, we already conducted a pilot study to assess the feasibility of this intervention and the effects on self-reported sleep. And on 92 people that conducted our pilot, randomized CBTI waitlist, we were able to observe a significant decrease in ISI, so improvement in ISI, but also interestingly, also improvement in anxiety symptoms, because this was a combined CBT, sleep, anxiety, depression, and we show that these online interventions work for reducing insomnia symptoms. So that's an ongoing study. Now, how much time left? Okay, not too bad. Okay, so I have also some data that I'm going to show on other type of interventions, because the CBTI is really to look at how can we intervene on insomnia with an established intervention to see the changes in cognitive functions. Now, if you want to target physiological features such as spindle slow waves, you need to go outside CBTI, because CBTI, as I showed you, doesn't really change objective sleep, and then we also show that it doesn't change spindle slow wave significantly. So if you want to change those microarchitecture, you have to do something different. And so there's a variety of techniques that have been used, but if you are interested in the field of sleep and memory, you've probably followed the literature on closed loop acoustic stimulation, which is a technique where you stimulate brief tones at the peak of the slow oscillation using an online, well, basically a system that checks the sleep architecture. So online, basically, and then not online, but in real time. And then you deliver brief tone each time that you reach the peak of the slow oscillation. And it's been shown that when you deliver those brief tones at the peak of a slow wave, during sleep, during deep sleep, you can actually increase the amplitude of the slow wave and also actually increase the suspended activity. And some studies conducted in healthy young adults shows that these actually also increase retention of declarative memories, such as word pairs, for example. This was published already more than 10 years ago by our German colleagues. But then there are also some studies suggest that this is also the case in older, healthy older adults. This study by Felice group in Chicago that showed that there is actually also improvement in slow wave amplitude and an improvement in declarative memories in healthy older adults with this technique. So we wanted to see, of course, if this works in people with insomnia. So we did a study. This was a study that I conducted in one of my previous sabbaticals in 2018 in Singapore with a group of Michael Chi. And we recruited 23 people with insomnia. And we had them, so we had them go 2 nights, counterbalance, 1 night with closed-loop acoustic stimulation and 1 night with a sham stimulation. And we wanted to see if this would change sleep architecture as expected, and also memory functions. And you'll see that this was a population of middle-age, young middle-age insomniacs. And pretty much in line with everything I showed you with insomnia, well, we didn't see much change. So it's always the same problem when you shift from a normal population to a clinical population. So we actually didn't see any significant change in declarative memory performance, no change in sleep architecture, but also no change in slow wave density, amplitude, duration of peak, or even spindle activity. So there was, though, some interesting associations that we observed. For example, individuals who had a better response with an increase in slow wave density from the stimulation, from sham to stimulation, also showed a better, higher improvement, so a decrease in sleep fragmentation in their PSG. So this shows that even though as a group of insomniacs, they are not as consistently responsive to this type of technique as healthy adults. There may be some of them who are responsive and who would show better sleep improvements. So that's the issue with insomnia. It's a very heterogeneous population, and we need to do more work to identify people who will be responsive, and this could be still the case. So that's how I was showing. So this was in lab on 1 night for the class. This was no older individuals. And in the future studies, we are currently applying for a grant to be able to do this at home, using not the PSG lab, but also the headbands and stimulation of sounds at home on multiple nights and on older individuals with insomnia disorder. And actually, there's been some interesting study in Alzheimer's disease showing the feasibility of this at home. So this was done by our colleagues in Leuven, showing that actually in Alzheimer's disease patients, this type of technique is feasible at home over multiple nights. But what you can see here, interestingly, is that you see on the right side pattern of response. And what can you see? They showed a significant improvement in slow activity, but you see that these effects are driven mainly by 3 or 4 subjects. And the majority of them actually show no significant change. So, it really shows the complexity when you try to apply this type of physical intervention to a clinical population, because there's so many other things that affect the response to these manipulations. Now, another type of stimulation that interested us, it's the rocking bed. And I'm sure that people, the lab of Sophie Schwartz and Virginie and Laurence Bayer, I think was online, are familiar with the work done by the group with Aurore, who was a PhD student here and is now has been done in my lab now in Australia. And so what we did was to, because the group in Geneva showed that rocking bed stimulation with a motor that basically moves the bed laterally at a low frequency and certain amplitude, increase both the slow wave activity, spin activity, and also retention of declarative memories. Our question was, can we do this in a more ecological system and see if it works? So the system that was in Geneva was a system that was, the whole bed was built in a customized fashion with a motor. What we wanted to do is to design a system that would be potentially applicable to anyone's home using your own bed, but under the bed frame, you would install this platform shown B that is actually in this case connected to a motor, like an engine. And this system basically also moves the bed, the mattress laterally. Okay. So this was a result of collaboration with my colleagues engineers at Concordia, with mechanical engineers. We built that system. And I'm just going to show you how actually this moves. Okay. So you see that it moves. It's doing what we're hoping it does. So it moves at this low frequency. All right. And so, so yeah, that was the first part of the study. The second part of the study, the first part was to conducted focus group with all the adults to see what would be acceptable for them. And they preferred to have a system that was under a mattress, because we also consider a system that would be under the complete bed, like the floor. But people hated it because there were safety concerns, obviously. If you have something on the floor, they could sleep on it. So we ended with that system. So first was the focus group, then the design of the system. And afterwards, then the third part is the testing. So the experimental testing. And this was the work of Aurore together with Emma, master students, and Loïc, a PhD student in my lab. And they conducted quite an very heavy protocol, because this was a 6-night study in the lab. So all subjects had one PSG night. Then they had 5 nights, 2 stationary nights, and 3 rocking nights. Because the goal was really to see if that system will improve sleep, memory, in overnights and over multiple nights, because the work conducted here previously showed that it works on one single night. And so that's the protocol. So it was counterbalanced. Some people had the stationary nights and the rocking nights, and others had the vice versa order. So within subject design. And so we had, for cognitive functions, we have declarative memory task with the same task that we used previously. A word persistation task, and then we also had a procedural memory task to look at whether the effects would be found also on motor skills. And so they conducted quite a significant amount of work. So from 30 subjects screened for eligibility, and after all the nights, and subjects having few subjects dropped out, we finally ended up with a sample of 19 subjects who completed the protocol. Actually 17 for the 5 nights, but only 19 completed 2 nights instead of 3 for the rocking night. And this is the subject, what I'm going to present. So memory, no change. Okay, yeah, no change. So even after 1 night, so no improvement in procedural memory, no improvement in declarative memory. And you can see that there was basically no condition effect at all. self-reported sleep. So that's interesting because we actually found that the subjects on the first night had the impression that the bed was noisy. That's the fourth graph. But they also reported that they had the impression they slept less, that they had more awakenings. And but that's on the first night. So that's the first working night, which is the bar in the middle, the purple bar in the middle. But then you see that these effects tend to wane over time. After the second and third night, you seem to have a recovery for total sleep time, sleep awakenings, and also even the noise seems to be not as bad. So there's a trend for acute sleep worsening with walking, which recovered overnight. So that's actually not really what we expected. In terms of PhD sleep architecture, we observed also something we didn't expect, which is actually that rocking bed tended to increase light sleep and decrease slow wave sleep and REM sleep during the first night. But interestingly, in nights 2 and 3, there was a decrease. So these effects kind of recovered, where the increase in night sleep got back to normal, so it decreased again. And the decrease in REM sleep, for example, increased again. So there seems to be an acute altered sleep architecture with that system. With walking, with a trend for recovery overnight. So people got habituated eventually, it was 2 or 3 nights, but not a big improvement in sleep architecture. So is it a failed experiment? Actually, no. Now we looked at spindles. And in terms of spindle, actually, we didn't see much change. There was a trend for reduction in spindle density on the first night, but not on the other nights. Actually, it was a gradual increase. But if you look at the 2 bottom traces, we did observe a spindle entrainment after the first night, so the second and third nights, along with this increase in spindle density. So this experiment we were able to entrain spindle. So it worked in doing what it's supposed to work. And actually, for slow waves, there was very few changes in slow wave metrics over the full night. But you see that we did observe an entrainment in the first night for slow oscillations during N2. And during N3, the effects were mostly pronounced during the third night. So there's few changes, but the entrainments was observed at least during N2. So this is data that I just got a couple of days ago. So we're still for doing further analysis, but what it shows that, not all rocking bed systems work to do what they were published to do, so improving sleep and memory. So I don't have time to go into details, but this system had advantages in terms of potential applicability in ecological environments, but the difference, so the frequency and the amplitude of movement was the same, but the movement, because of the type of engine, the movement was less smooth than the movement that was induced in the Geneva system. That there were the more saccadic movements towards the end of the movement on both sides. And we think that this may actually be responsible for the blunted effects that we observe, or the less consistent effects, these sort of little edgy movements towards the end. This is really mechanical engineering, and I have no knowledge about this, but when we looked at the different patterns of movements, this may be the reason why. So but we still observe these entrainments in terms of sleep oscillations. And at the end of the day, it seems that this is still something that is potentially of interest. And next step would be to maybe tweak the system a little bit. But I think still a very interesting and area worthy of exploration. Okay, I'm a bit over time, but I'm going to finish with exercise. So in the lab, we're also interested in exercise because the question is, can we use exercise to also improve the effect of sleep on memory consolidation? Why do we think it's the case? We published a couple of years ago a study where we had people nap in the lab, or not nap, but basically the people were divided in 4 groups. They had a learning task and a delayed recall. This was an association task. And so they were divided in 4 groups, depending on whether or not they had a nap between the learning and the recall, or they had an exercise, a moderate exercise, moderate intensity exercise, basically 30 minutes of stationary bike before learning or not. And so what we did observe is that, interestingly, people who exercised before learning and napped after learning had the highest improvement in memory recall after sleep. That's what you observe on the left bar. And it was better than people who only exercised and people who only napped. And what we found is people that exercise and nap. Actually, we still come back to the spindle, and it seems to be an obsession. But so the highest the spindle was during the nap after exercise, the better the recall was. So there seems to be some interaction, some synergy between exercise and sleep when it comes to memory consolidation. So the question I asked myself was, well, if that's the case, can we actually use exercise to compensate the effect of sleep restriction on memory? Okay, so that's a study that we did. We published a study one last year, and then we actually completed another study I'm not going to show today that basically confirmed these effects. So this was a study that was actually conducted during the COVID. So what we did, we adapted the protocol to be done remotely. So we had the young healthy adults divided in 4 groups, and the 4 groups differed on the presence or not of sleep restriction, and the presence or not of exercise before learning. In this case, we used the high intensity exercise training, HIIT, for those of you who know, and we did then a learning after HIIT or no HIIT, and then a recall after sleep. And so that's how the protocol looked like. So they had a remote HIIT intervention or a sedentary period before learning at home. Then they had the learning. Then afterwards, they had a sleep opportunity that was either normal or shorter, and they had a recall. And what we observed, that's the exercise we did because we did it remotely. So we did body weight exercise training of I think it was approximately 15 minutes, 2 minutes of warm-up, 12 minutes of HIIT. This is actually the exercise protocol we use. So, that's standard exercise, squats, lunges, burpees, and so on. Actually quite intense. I did it a couple of times. And then when it cooled down. So it was like high intensity. And there was a research assistant monitoring people over Zoom to see that they did it correctly. And what we found is actually, as you can imagine, so that the S8 showed, of course, a higher recall after sleep than before sleep. The S5, so only 5 hours of sleep opportunity, showed a decreased recall. It was significantly bad, but you see that the HIIT S5 doesn't show any significant change anymore in terms of memory recall. And same actually for also the HIIT S8. So this really showed that when you do exercise before learning, this seems to attenuate the effect of sleep restriction memory recall. And I don't have slides here, but we actually finished the study, and we just had results a couple of weeks ago that show that we did the same protocol, but not same, a similar protocol in the lab with moderate intensity exercise, the bike, and we had the sleep study. And with that type of protocol, we also confirmed that exercise attenuate the effect of sleep restriction, even using moderate intensity exercise in a controlled environment. And now we're looking at what are the sleep measures that would maybe explain these effects. So that suggests that really exercise is something also to consider when it comes to looking at the effects of cognitive health. And we published some meta-analysis showing that actually when you look at the literature in people with cognitive impairment, there are a couple of studies that show that exercise actually also improves subjectively and objectively their sleep measures. But what we don't know is whether those exercises would work in people with insomnia disorder, because most of the studies were conducted without the characterization of sleep disorders. And most importantly, what would be the effect on sleep macro? lecture because we still want to see the mechanisms behind them. All right, so I think I'm not too bad in terms of timing. So insomnia disorder is associated with poor memory and predict self-reported cognitive decline, show you the spinal slow oscillations predict cognitive worsening and neurodegeneration in older adults with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease. I showed that CBTI may reduce self-reported cognitive difficulties, but the effect on cognition in older adults are still unclear. Individuals with higher spinal density may be more responsive, something to explore further. Close-up acoustic stimulation boosts slow oscillation memory in healthy adults, but the effect on insomnia disorder are much less consistent. Rocking back stimulation over multiple nights entrains spindle activity, and to a lesser extent slow oscillation with less consistent effect on memory. But this may be due to the mechanism of the rocking system, and exercise may compensate the effect of sleep loss on memory consolidation. Right. And these are all the people responsible for the work I've done. I've presented today because I didn't do any of this work. This was done by my team of research associate, postdoc, grad students, research assistants, and the so numerous undergrad volunteers that have space to list, and all the collaborators involved in those studies. Thank you very much for your attention.